Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our fifth session of NAA's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Week. See My Story, Leading in Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion through Accessibility, Authenticity, and Vulnerability. My name is James Swart, and I'm the Director of Education and Leadership Development here at the National Apartment Association. Thanks so much for joining us today. Before we get started, I wanted to share a few housekeeping notes. Today's session is being recorded and will be made available on the NAA website, as well as our YouTube channel following the session. We've also saved a little bit of time at the end for questions from you, the audience. So at any time during the session, feel free to drop your question in the Q&A box or in the chat box, and we will get to that at the end. I also want to extend a special thanks to the Home Depot Pro for their sponsorship of this year's DE&I Awareness Week. We are thankful for their partnership with the National Apartment Association. And with that, it's my pleasure to introduce our esteemed panel for today. Joining us, we have Kara House, Director of Communications and Public Affairs at the Bella Group, Ishia Shepard, Assistant Vice President at the AMC Delancey Group, and Lori Oliver Goldman, Vice President of Diversity and Inclusion at Avenue 5 Residential. Lori, Ishia, Kara, welcome, and I will turn the floor over to you.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you, James, for that lovely introduction. And happy Friday, everyone, and thank you for joining our session. We're really excited. We have some great information to share today. Don't forget to please join us in the conversation, and most importantly, we really want to hear from you. We want to learn from you, and we want to support you in sharing stories to encourage you to share your story as well. So we decided we're going to kick off our session by talking a little bit about storytelling first and why it's so important, such a crucial role in the context of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So it is one of the most universal human experiences when you hear someone's story. It gives you a rare chance to look through new lenses and feel a little bit different and be open to others. So stories really promote that empathy part. And you have the power with the story to really humanize your journey, and you have the power to accept others' journeys and support them in their path. So storytelling, it helps people understand the challenge that others face, and then fostering a greater sense of compassion and understanding, while also creating that sense of belonging, right? So when you tell a story, it opens you up. People feel like they want to bring you in a little bit more, and you feel like you're part of the group when you're telling stories, especially when someone projects their story off of your story and the stories just continue. It's so powerful. So we thought today, next slide, please, Jane, what we would review first is kick it off by telling our stories, each of our stories. One more, James, please. So I will kick off with my story to just tell you a little bit how I came into the work and why it's so important to me. I probably was in the path of D&I before it even had a title, because I just remember myself always wanting to help others. I remember early on in school, you're supposed to behave, you're not supposed to talk. I remember someone was picking on my friend Isabel, and I was in no means the type of tough person, but I remember standing up for her. And then I ended up getting in trouble, and I thought, ooh, when I get home, I'm going to get in trouble for my mom and dad. But what really happened was my dad asked me what happened, and I told him what happened. And he's all, I'm proud of you. You're standing up to someone that couldn't stand up for themselves. And so that is what diversity, equity, inclusion, why it's so important to me, because there's so many people that are not fortunate to have a voice, right? Or to be able to share or have a seat at the table. But I'm blessed to have that voice and to share it with others. And so that's what I take with me and hold in my heart as a foundation of why I do what I do. Ishia?
So I want to start by saying I had a different story that I was going to tell you guys about my journey into this space, but I thought about it really hard last night, and I was like, I want to be super honest and transparent because I have seen so many amazing presentations this week, and I wanted to just be really honest. So growing up, I always wanted people to feel like included, and I wanted to be everyone's friend. But I was also very comfortable with code switching and kind of like assimilating to be people's friends and to feel welcome in spaces where I might normally not have been. And I don't think that I really recognized the importance of being yourself and showing up as who you were until I became a mom. And if any of you know me, you know I have a beautiful daughter, and I hope she's watching because I sent her the link. But her name is Michael. And as she got older and she went to school, she kind of said, like, do you know Michael's a boy's name? And do you know that people think that I'm a boy? And we had to sit her down and say, that was a conscious decision because we wanted you to be accepted in every space. And we never wanted to limit your opportunities because people thought that they knew who you were before they met you. And after having to say that to a 6-year-old, I realized that while I love her name and she is definitely a Michael, because all the, Jordan Jackson, they're great, um, that I didn't like that. And I didn't want a world where she had to shapeshift and be anything but whoever she wanted to be. So that was kind of my journey into really making spaces for others to not just be there, but be there as their whole selves. Kara?
Shia, I love that story so much because I used to be an educator, and one of the first lessons that I would always do in my classes was one that we would call Me by My Name. And we would share the stories of what our names were and where they came from and some of the funny history behind it. I think there's a chance my dad is on and watching, so I'm not trying to call out my parents on this, but one of the stories that I love to share with my classes was also a reason that some of my, especially Middle Eastern students, would take my class was the spelling of my first name. It means something very specific in Arabic. That basically the combination of my first name and last name was, a student told me at one point, it's kind of like a bathroom. So you can take from that what you will, but it was just a fun way to start with that vulnerability and sharing. I love my name. I love the spelling of it. I love the uniqueness of it. I love the musicality of it. It was just an inadvertent coincidence that it means something in a different language. But how beautiful is that to see those combinations of stories coming together? For me, my work in DEI really goes back, I think, to being a kid. And I was a very shy kid, and I've always been shy. I lean into my introversion now, but I always wanted to be that person who didn't let other people feel what I felt. I would often feel like I was on my own. And so I would seek out that other shy kid and just say, let's be best friends. Let's be there for each other. Let's create a space for, now I wasn't saying this in like second grade, but let's create a space of belonging for each other so that we don't have to be in this on our own. So I also have always come from my family, especially on, really both sides of my family are big storytellers. And just leaning into that background and being a writer myself, it was just the importance of seeing all these different stories and asking questions of people that made me realize how important all of this really is. So that's where I come from. And James, if you can advance to the next slide. So we've shared our stories, and we're now going to dive into the conversation of storytelling and story sharing through 3 different lenses. So I'm going to hand it back to you, Lori, to share about accessibility, and then we will continue through this conversation. So next slide, and I'll hand it back to you, Lori.
Kara, it's hard to take that time back. Your story was so impactful. It kind of gave me chills and kind of put tears in my eyes and made me laugh at the same time. So thank you for sharing that. And Aishia, thank you for sharing yours too. Accessibility. So when you're really thinking about accessibility and in this space of D&I, why is it so important? It's because it engages people at all levels. And that's what you want to do. So I'm going to come from a place of speaking from my culture with Avenue 5. So fivers out there supporting. Thank you so much. And high five to you. So we're going to take it start with the culture dive. So the journey with Avenue 5 really started in 2020, like most of you all. And with that journey, it was about discovery for me and first looking into what the company already had in place, right? Not recreating the wheel, because it would have been really hard to accept and embed that DEI within the culture if it wasn't already a foundation of the culture. So when you look at that, we have our 5 core beliefs that we believe in at Avenue 5, and it's already surrounded by putting people first and just really empowering people and allowing them to have a voice, focusing on solutions by allowing people to come in with their voices and give opinions and really push those ideas. So when you're looking at the culture dive of a company with D&I, you have to start with your culture and ensure that it's embedded into your culture if you want that to continue to evolve. And then you want to identify, how does D&I really fit into the culture, right? So ours was already there as a foundation, but how the challenge became, how are we going to, now we have this focus of DE&I, how are we going to ensure that it continues to align with what our culture is and not separating the two? So I'm sure a lot of you have heard in the news, you have laws that saying you can't take training on D&I anymore. You have companies that are thinking about demolishing their D&I. You have, it always feels like this fight. But I'm going to tell you, if it's embedded in your culture, it's hard to get rid of it, right? We know there's good and bad in the culture, but something like this, when it's bringing people together, it will continue to evolve. Then you look at meeting people where they're at. And that was really huge with us. And how did we do that? You have the D&I survey that NAA has put out 2 years in a row. I'm not sure if we're doing it this year or not, but that survey was really eye-opening as an industry, but also for us as an organization, because it allowed us to identify the voices of our associates in those surveys, take that information and bring it back to the culture and how to move forward and evolve. So when doing that, also, you always, if you have to measure something to keep it going too, right? So with doing that, it was setting goals. So it was identifying. Our plan started with the 5-year plan, right? So it was led by our CEO, Walt Smith, who then came to me and said, hey, I want you to head this up. What do you think? And of course, I was nervous and I can't do this, and all the negative comes into you. But I'm going to tell you, all you need is one voice to plant that seed, and you're able to just move mountains. And I feel with the support and accessibility I've had with our leadership, the support and accessibility I've had with our on-site associates to be honest and genuine and come to me and give ideas and understand that just because I have the title, this is for all of us. I'm just a voice that has a seat at the table right now. And believe me, you want to keep pulling up so there's more voices that can be heard. So with that, with setting goals, we did set out to have a 5-year plan at Avenue 5. At first, getting started, we were looking what everyone else is doing. I think that's what happens. You're trying to keep up with the Joneses. But if you continue to try to keep up with the Joneses, you're going to get lost within your own culture, because your culture may not be ready for certain things. And I get challenges. We get new associates to come on all the time, and they're like, what about groups? Yes, we're going to get there. It's in the 5-year plan, but it may not be ready yet. We implemented gender pronouns in ours, and the accessibility. Why did it happen? Because we had accessibility to hear different voices of what it meant for different people to be an ally. And then we had it for different levels that were able to allow us to project on that. So setting goals will continue to allow you to evolve in this space. And setting goals, you're getting involved and having accessibility to set those goals and get the stamp of approval from all levels within the organization. And then most importantly, we've been now, so it's 2023. And I'm going to tell you, it's measuring things, right? It's identifying, how do you identify what your ROI is and what's bringing back? And a lot of that is identifying its engagement, right? So that was one of our things too. Retention, are we able to keep people? Reputation, recruiting, and then engaging our associates was a way to keep our program evolving. And we actually call ours a collective. We started with a program, but then thought programs come and go. D&I is here to stay. So let's call it what it is. It's a collective, because it's going to continue to collect. It's going to continue to evolve. And all that is through accessibility and making sure that you have those voices and accessibility to those people throughout the organization, not just the top, because you can push something down from the top, but by the time it gets to the middle, nothing's happening. So you need accessibility to all levels within your organization to be helpful and ensure that this space is going to continue. Now, with accessibility, you can't have accessibility without having authenticity. So they're very closely interconnected in the realm of diversity and inclusion and equity. And both really of the concepts really are integral to fostering truly inclusive environment. So with this, I'm going to turn it over to Aishia, who's going to talk about authenticity.
So, if again, I am assuming that all of you people know me because that's my personality. But I am such a proponent of authenticity, and especially through the lens of DE&I. And I think that's because when you talk about being your authentic self at work, it's kind of a buzzword right now. So a lot of companies and a lot of organizations are saying, we want you to bring your authentic self. We want you to bring who you are. And I think that that is great, but it is so important that when organizations say that, they mean it in a very real way. So bringing your authentic self to work means bringing your whole self. So I like to joke, for me, I am a mom. So I'm bringing that mom life to work, which means that I can hear things 2 offices away. Um, that's my whole self. I am also an elder millennial, so my knees ain't doing what they used to do. But if you put on the right song, I think they're still working. And it sounds like, light and a joke, but the truth is that there's all of these things that make me me. And there's all of these things that make all of us who we are. So when you talk about DE&I initiatives and bring your authentic self to work, I think some organizations fear that with authenticity, there will become a lack of professionalism or something that's inappropriate. And I want to start by saying that your authentic self is always still going to be your professional self. My authentic self is still going to be on time and get reports done and, be pleasant and great at all of the things that my role encompasses. But it also means that my team members are going to know me as a person, because the truth is, trust in your leadership is the first step to have equitable and inclusive spaces, because no matter what you think your culture is built on, it's ultimately built on trust. So if I don't trust that I can bring myself to work without being penalized, then I'm never going to bring my full self to work. And it's so important also that if you are in a leadership role, you are bringing your full self to work. Because for so long, and this is just as a societal thing, there was an image of what leadership looked like. And regardless of your age, your gender, how you identify, I am positive that there's something within you that did not identify with what we have been told leadership is supposed to be. So what happens is you'd come to work and you'd be like, oh, I'm putting on my work cap. So that means that I talk about this and I don't talk about that, and I like this and I don't like that. And I think that we're in an age right now where we have the freedom to know I can be amazing at my job and I can support my organization and be myself and have that freedom, and also be celebrated. So again, authenticity should be synonymous with good leadership, because I want to trust my leaders. We are in the multifamily housing industry, and let's be honest, it is a tough industry. Whether you are a leasing professional, a service tech, a regional, you work really, really hard. And for me to ask my team members to work this hard and to pour themselves into an industry, and they don't know me, or they don't know the president of my organization, it just doesn't feel right. So I think that that's why when I talk about authenticity and storytelling, it's important to, one, show up as who you are, because storytelling is very much so an action. It's sharing. When people ask me what I did this weekend, I got my hair braided, and that was 8 hours. And I'm going to tell you guys something in a very safe space. For the first 5 years of my career, when I would spend a whole day getting my hair braided, but people ask me what I did, I would always be like, nothing. And that was because I wasn't comfortable sharing my full self. And by me starting to share, then I would have, someone else come in and say, oh, I drag race on the weekends. And I'm like, you drag race? Who are you? Like, I realized that I cared for these people and I worked so close with them. We're in the trenches, but we didn't even know each other. So no, yeah, Dana, drag race. My service supervisor drag races on the weekend. We worked together 5 years before he shared that. And I think that that just goes to show you, you have these amazing team members and they are their role, but they're more than their role. But for us to figure that out, we have to create spaces for them to share their stories. So, along with sharing their stories, I want to make sure that I give you guys a couple just like really brief things that you can do to help prompt that in your culture at your organization. So, a really good one is a lunch and learn. Just like get everyone together and say, hey, honestly, what did you do this weekend? If you binge watched The Real Housewives, I'm in support of that. But if you prepared for a 5K, I'm in support of that too. So give people the space to share their stories. And then also listen to understand their perspective and who they are, but not to agree. Because we're not here to agree with everyone. We're here to make space for everyone's stories. So that's really like my gist on being your authentic self. And I hope that you guys can take that with you. Along with being your authentic self, there's a sense of vulnerability because it's like, I'm going to show you the real me. And now you have a chance to either like it or dislike it. And Kara is going to take us into the vulnerability that comes with storytelling.
Thank you, Aishia, and thank you, Lori. Those were both just absolutely amazing, and I'm honored to share this space with both of you. Aishia, I want to latch on to one of the things that you shared about the importance of being active and having action in this, because you know what? We're on the last day of DEI Awareness Week, and I want to challenge us all to remember that the next step that we're all taking beyond awareness is action. That's the very next thing that we have to do. It's not just about knowing all of this stuff, but the question is, what are we going to do with it now? What are we going to do about the different challenges that we're facing? So we're talking about thoughtful action, purposeful action, meaningful action that's aiming to create a sense of belonging for every single member of our team. It's that willingness to shift from an it's always been that way mindset to a vision for our teams that sees power sharing as a strength and not as a threat. And it's that willingness to be open, transparent, and vulnerable in and about the journeys that we're on together. So what Lori and Aishia both just brilliantly shared was taking us through that mindset shift and the goal of building belonging. So I'm going to focus in on that last part in terms of taking that vulnerable approach to sharing the story and the journey of DEI. So when we're engaging in meaningful DEI efforts, and as we're striving to build belonging in our organizations and for our people, we really have to come with that willingness to be vulnerable in the process. That means being willing to learn as we go and willing to learn as we grow. And I think that's so core to everything that we're talking about, is that willingness to accept that we don't know everything. I don't know everything. Even as I'm leading different efforts, I'm growing in that. And I'm willing to share that I'm still learning and growing along with everyone that I'm leading. So when I talk about leaders, the first thing I want to note is that I am talking to every leader who's in this room, whether you are specifically a leader of DEI efforts within your organization, or if you're a leader in general in an organization that's striving to cultivate culture with DEI as a core component, any leader that's in this space. I'm talking to you right now when I say that we have to be willing to lead by example. In every aspect of leading within an organization, I think it's safe to say that we're usually approaching that with the mindset of not asking our teams to follow where we're not willing to go ourselves. And the same has to be true of building belonging. When we're offering programming, including things like employee resource groups or affiliate groups, lunch and learns, brave conversations, all of those different things that we're trying to offer our teams, we're asking our team members to engage in storytelling and story sharing to build understanding. And we can't ask them to step into that vulnerable space of sharing of themselves without being willing to share of ourselves as well. So when we're sharing our own stories and when we're willing to offer that level of transparency and vulnerability and acknowledging what we don't know and where we're still learning, where we're still growing ourselves, that makes a huge difference in fostering trust and building that belief among our team members that if there's still room for me as a leader to grow, then there's also still room for them to grow, to make mistakes, to step into transparency and vulnerability, to be willing to share of themselves and to be willing to weave that growth together into the growth of our organizations as a whole. I want to go back a bit and tie into what Aishia shared about authenticity to say that being vulnerable also means that we have to be true. And by that, I mean that all members of our team, and especially in this conversation, those of us who are leaders, we need to be willing to come into conversations, engagements, and shared growth with a willingness to be vulnerable in our authenticity. I'm going to quote Brene Brown a couple of times here, so bear with me. But one of my favorite quotes from her is that true belonging doesn't require you to change who you are. It requires you to be who you are. And I love that quote so much for this conversation because it reminds us that vulnerability is a key component of building belonging. It's being and sharing of who you are, and it's being and sharing who you really are. Because let's face it, I know for myself as a leader, I don't want to expose my belly. I don't want to be stepping out and showing that I'm nervous, I'm afraid, I'm not sure how this conversation or how this event or how this program is going to go, but I am willing to step out in that anyway. There is absolutely nothing easy about being so real that folks around us might see all of us. But to once again borrow from Brene Brown, and I'm trying to pull up this quote because she gives two really great definitions of vulnerability that I think are really emphasizing its importance in this conversation. In one quote, she says that vulnerability is the core, the heart, and the center of meaningful human experiences. And there's another quote from her that she gives in a conversation I think she had at the University of Minnesota. And she says that vulnerability is the birthplace of love, belonging, joy, courage, empathy, and creativity. And how beautiful is that? How beautiful is it that vulnerability is really the space that we come to build belonging? By being willing to be vulnerable, to live in our truth, and to step into and walk in our stories. What we're doing is creating powerful bonds that grow the belonging our full teams can feel within that shared story that we're writing together in all that we do. Just sharing from a personal place with some of the work that we're doing with the company I work for, the Bella Group. We've really been focusing in on the theme of our Bella tapestry and our Bella thread. With that idea of the tapestry, we're telling folks that everything that we do and everything that we are as individuals is a thread in that tapestry. We're all telling our story. We're all contributing a piece of the puzzle that's coming together to show the full tapestry of the story that we're telling together. And I want to acknowledge that in that and weaving that tapestry and telling these stories collectively and working together in all of this, we have to acknowledge that to be vulnerable, we also have to be brave. I already said that there's nothing easy about being real. What I really mean is that vulnerability be scary, y'all. It is straight up scary. It takes courage. It takes the willingness to step out in bravery to work our way towards building connection with those who are different than us, to include ideas and voices we might not otherwise open ourselves up to, and to create equitable places of belonging for everyone who shares in our story. Vulnerability has been growing in its recognition as a key competency in leadership, which is a really important shift because for a long time, vulnerability was seen as a weakness rather than as a strength. The reality is vulnerability is a strength because it takes so much courage. It takes that willingness to face the fear of stepping into the unknown, which is a big fear for so many in our organizations when we start DEI journeys. We find ourselves afraid to ask questions because we think we're going to say the wrong thing, or afraid to share of ourselves because we think we're going to be judged. The challenge that we're facing in these conversations is to face that fear and step out onto that path of inclusion and belonging anyway. It's being willing to embrace curiosity. It's asking questions even when we're afraid of the answers. It's being transparent even when we're afraid to be seen. And it's being open and seeking to understand even when we're afraid to change. It's that willingness to get comfortable with being uncomfortable, which is one of my absolute favorite phrases in the DEI realm. And it's one that really makes people nervous because I could ask people to raise their hands and say, who's comfortable being uncomfortable? Who wants to be uncomfortable? The likelihood is there's not going to be a whole lot of hands going up because we love to dwell in comfort. I like to be comfortable. I'm sitting on a couple blankets right now because I want to be absolutely comfortable everywhere that I am. But doing this work takes willingness to be vulnerable, to step out in that fear, and to do the work anyway. And if there's one challenge that I'd like to leave everyone who's with us today with, it's just that, to be open to the thrill ride of questions and curiosity, of courage and challenges that is building belonging through our shared stories. So next slide, James. With that, we have shared our stories personally, and we've taken that deeper dive into the role of storytelling in meaningful DEI efforts. So we're going to wrap up the conversation with some key takeaways from this session for this whole week of DEI awareness and for all the meaningful DEI efforts that we're going to be engaging in going forward. Next slide. So the first thing, I just said this, DEI is not easy. We are willing to be uncomfortable in these conversations because we know that they're important. As a person coming from a background as a Black woman, I can tell you that being someone of a marginalized identity does not make it any easier to have this sort of conversation. It's still hard. It's what I call the hard work and the heart work, right? Because we do it anyway, even though it's not easy. We're willing to step into that discomfort because we know we need to have these conversations anyway. Next slide. So also DEI is not about 100% agreement. So often we come into these conversations and these spaces thinking that everyone who engages in it is going to come to the same conclusions. The reality is that creating safe spaces doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to agree. It means that we are able to understand each other. And that's the important goal of DEI, is not to make sure that everyone 100% all the time agrees with everything that everybody else says. That's never going to happen. That's never been the expectation. But to be able to better understand where we're coming from in those differences, it makes us better able to work through and understand where those differences are coming from, to know the stories of the people that we're working with. And so we're better able to function in those spaces because we don't necessarily agree, but we can definitely align in that mutual understanding. Next slide, and I'll turn it back over to you, Lori.
Thank you. So first thing, a takeaway is D&I is not about changing people. That's really important. And just realizing that in the essence, these three concepts are interconnected and mutually reinforced. So when you think of diversity, it's going to brings a variety of perspective and experience. Equity ensures the fairness and opportunity for all. And then inclusion enables the full utilization of the diversity to drive innovation, creativity, and social progress. So based on this, what is D&I about? It's about accepting people and making a difference. Next slide, please. DEI is not decisive. So while DEI can touch political topics and spectrums, it's important to remember that it is not a polarized topic. So that is something that it's sometimes made out to be, though. So because DE&I is a human thing, it's not meant to separate people. It's part of the story of who we are and how we live. Next slide, please.
So DE&I is for you. So kind of to piggyback off of what Lori just said, in a lot of spaces, DE&I is being seen as like divisive or to separate people. But the truth is, literally, the point of DE&I is for everyone of all backgrounds from everywhere with every type of small difference that you could possibly think of to feel like they belong, to feel welcome, and to feel like their voice can be heard. So regardless of if you see yourself as someone from a marginalized background or you feel like you've never been marginalized, DE&I is for you, because if you're marginalized, it's for you to find your voice. And if you're someone who feels like, hey, I've never had these problems, it's for you to learn how to use your voice to help uplift others and support others. So DE&I is for everyone and their mama and their grandmom and anyone that you can think of. Next slide.
Okay, so sorry.
This is me, right?
Yes, sorry.
Everybody, we're so passionate about it, we don't know. And then DE&I is in you. So I like to say this work isn't on you, it's in you. Because as humans, we want to have connection and we want to have emotional connections to people, and we want to feel, again, like we belong, like we have a home. And so the nature of DE&I work is inherently ingrained in us. Like, it's biology to want to feel like these are my people. And how great would it be if no matter where you went in the world, you felt like these are my people because we're all included and we all belong. Next slide, and I think Kara.
Actually, it's Lori.
Lori. It was a good run, guys.
It was. We had choices. So D&I is through you. So when you're looking at that, people are watching you and they will be watching you and how you're leading the charge. So when you're in this space, you have to realize and remember your story and what brought you here, because they will challenge you, right? So what you got to remember, what's motivating you to be in this space, what's getting you to be involved, and the importance of what made you want to advocate change, because through you, you can make it better, so that you can be a good example and show people exactly what it looks like in the D&I space. Kara, next slide, please.
All right. And to close this out, DEI will grow you. There is always more room to grow, and there's always going to be more to know in this space. As you can see from the end of our presentation, we're not perfect. We have those same challenges that you all have going into these conversations, but we're willing to do it anyway. And we are willing to work with each other and celebrate the successes and also celebrate those challenges that we're facing together, right? It's not a bad thing to understand that you just learned something new, that maybe you made an assumption in the past, and through doing the work, you learn that there's a different way to think about something, and that's growing you. It's a really beautiful thing. We're coming into this space with that willingness to ask questions and that willingness to grow through the process of engaging in this work. I always say that the costliest thing that you can do in the DEI space is make assumptions. But one of the most beneficial things that you can do is to ask and to offer, to ask what's needed and to be available to meet people where they are. Lori spoke about that earlier, how important that is, to be willing to meet people in the spaces that they actually are, not the spaces that we assume that they are. There can be sometimes nothing more damaging than to assume either the best or the worst of someone that you don't bother to ask where they're actually coming from. we've had conversations before, and I had this conversation with my own team about some of the assumptions that have been made of us. And we had people share everything from the assumption that they wouldn't be able to do something because they were new or because they came from a different background and it was assumed that they wouldn't have experience with something, to one of the stories that I shared was a more positive side of assumption, but still something that caused a lot of personal anxiety for me, was the assumption that because I was good at one thing, I was good at everything, and I could do this next project that I had no experience with, that I really had no context for, and that I would just be able to figure it out. And sometimes those assumptions are assuming the best in us, but it creates that space for that uncertainty of, now what do I do? If I fail at this, is that going to change the perception of me within an organization? When sometimes the easiest thing that we can do is just ask that question of, is this something that you're interested in doing, or that you have experience with, or that you want to be part of? There's so much to say for being willing and being available to meet people where they are in these conversations, and to giving ourselves grace and to giving grace to others. We often talk in DEI conversations about the difference between our intentions and our impact. And we have to understand that while we might have meant the best, we might have done something that really created a challenge for somebody else. And being willing to grow through that realization is so important, because it makes us better as individuals. It improves the working environment for that person that was willing to come to us and tell us what that challenge was. And it creates growth for our entire organization, because when I grow, when Aishia grows, when Lori grows, we're growing individually and we're growing together. And as we're growing together, we're also growing our organizations and making them so much better for having been part of the conversation. So next slide, James. That's it for our main presentation, and we'd love to open the floor for any questions from the audience, questions from the other members of the panel, if we have questions for each other. I certainly have a question for Miss Lori if we don't see any questions coming into the chat. So let's open the floor for that.
Carol, while we're waiting on folks to put those questions into the chat, why don't you go ahead and start with your question for Lori?
Yeah, so Lori, I loved what you shared at the beginning about setting some of the goals and measurements for your DEI efforts. And I'd love to hear just more about what that process looked like for setting those goals, for figuring out what they were, and then how you worked through the measurements of it over time.
Okay. Thank you for that question. I was a little nervous there. Thank you. So the way that it started was just taking just a simple business tactic of discovery first, and kind of discovering what we already had in place, reviewing it, challenging it, and looking for opportunities to advance areas to include diversity, equity, inclusion elements into it. In setting the goals, I started with, tell you the truth, 100 probably goals, just looking at other people. And that's why I mentioned don't keep up with the Joneses, because everyone was going crazy in 2020, especially in our industry. We were all trying to copy each other and do different things. And I just remember going to my supervisor, Lori Brashear, and saying, Lori, here's my list of things I want to do. And I remember her telling me, you know what? I want you to go back and I want you to pick the top 5 that you're like, need to get done this year. And let's start there and taking out the top. So that's what we did. We took the top 5 most important things to us and identified which elements would be the foundation for each of the goals. So for us, we focused on recruiting, we focused on associate advancement. Another foundation of ours is educating our associates. We look at networking externally, and then most importantly, getting involved Now it's continued to evolve. We're focused on, our company's always been a company in which we believe in giving back into the communities in which we operate in. We have a volunteer day that we give to our associates, but we've added different elements of that 100 list and just pushed it out to where it's at. Now, do we adjust it sometimes? Yes. There were some things that I said maybe the top 5, but then something else comes up or another story or someone else brings something else up. And I think the best part and the way we've been able to push our D&I initiatives and continue to evolve is the openness and the accessibility of our leadership team to shift when we need to shift. Did that answer your question, Sarah?
Does. I love all of that.
Thank you.
So I have one question for all 3 of you to kind of close out our DE&I awareness week, and that is, what is one action that you would share with everyone on the line today that they can go back and do in their company starting this afternoon or on Monday morning to advance diversity, equity, and inclusion?
Ooh, James. Oh. Kara, do you want to go first?
I can kick us off. Yeah, I'd love to start on that one. So I love the question because it's one that we build into the Lunch and Learn program that we've been doing with our team. The last question that's asked for the entire group is, what's one thing in your specific role or in your specific place that you can do to advance whatever it is that we learned that day? So I think that's the number one action that folks can take, is taking the things that they've learned and figuring out how they can apply it to what they do. When we're talking about inclusive leadership, thinking about, what does it mean for me as a director of communications to be inclusive? What questions would I ask a resident who's coming to me with an issue to help them and to really make them feel heard, to feel like they belong as part of the community, and to make them feel like they are actually included in reaching the solution? I think that comes into play for everyone, no matter if you're a maintenance professional, if you're a regional director, if you're a leasing professional. There's always something that you can do to apply that new thing that you learned to your specific role, to build that and to grow the level of belonging within your organization, within your company, or even within your property. So being willing to ask that question of yourself and apply that out is, I think, a really important first step.
That was so good.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to also preface this by saying, if you guys haven't noticed, I'm like DE&I for dummies. So I like to keep things light, because I feel like I never want people to be overwhelmed by topics or just feel like that they don't have an articulate or educated enough answer. So one thing that we do within our organization is we ask everyone, like, you know how when you watch a movie and someone comes out and there's that song and that song embodies them, and like immediately this character is going to be like this. So we ask everyone, like, what's that song for you, and tell us the story behind it. And you would be surprised at like the answers you get from people, and just how much it teaches you about their personality. And this is kind of funny, but I always share this because the president of my organization loves Bone Thugs and Harmony because he's from Ohio. And so when he told us that, I was like, I know you so much better. Like, and it sparked just, it was such an easy question. It wasn't a heavy lift. And we talked about it for like 20 minutes as a group. So I think trying to ask questions that may feel a little bit lighter, but things that are humanly, like people love music, people love food. I think that really does help build connections in a way that might not always be so scary.
And then for me, one thing I'd like for you to take away today is just what we went over. Identify who your allies are, make sure you're accessible for people to talk to, be curious, most importantly, be your authentic self, be who you are. You don't have to change yourself to go have a conversation. And then most importantly, is embrace vulnerability. That's huge. We're all nervous sometimes. We're all scared sometimes, but you know what? It's okay. And I know with me, people get tired of hearing it. A lot of times they'll say, "Oh, I'm so scared." But to me, when I say that, it almost comforts me because then someone else will say, "I'm nervous too." And then you've already bonded and you've connected with someone. So just remember, numbers don't inspire us to change. They never have, right? But what does is your stories and being open to those.
Great. Thank you all. And we've had one other question come in. How does one address unconscious bias and promote awareness among members?
You know what? Go ahead. I see. You want to do it? Or
Well, I'll be really brief. I'll just say I think the biggest way to kind of acknowledge it is that we literally all have it. And it's ingrained in us. So the best thing that I think you can do is like try as an organization to put things in place so that unconscious biases can be checked with it. Like, so whether it's your hiring practices, whether it's how you promote, try to make sure that you're putting things in place to help offset those. But also to what I think we've said throughout the whole presentation is that we're human, so you are going to make mistakes, but just if you can take your unconscious bias and move it into conscious, so like when you do have those thoughts, you can stop yourself and refocus and pivot. That's really the best thing that I think you can do in like real time.
and I'm going to jump on that as well. It's that identifying piece because we always say we always have it, but sometimes we can't recognize it in ourselves. And until we can recognize it in ourselves, we're not going to be able to help people recognize and identify with theirs. And I'll give you a quick example. I also volunteer outside in my community, outside of work a lot of times. And we were putting this activity together, a picnic, and someone brought up, hey, those the games that you came up with were not inclusive. And that was one of the things. So I'm like sitting here thinking, I'm like, well, so I didn't know the names of the games, so I didn't know what they were, but I started Googling the games. I'm like, well, you can do it sitting up and you can do it sitting down. Why is it not inclusive? And I thought to myself, it took me a while to keep reading the person's email that they sent to realize who am I to say what their disability is? Who am I to limit it? And I caught my own unconscious bias. And until I was able to catch my own, I was not able to share it with everyone else to go, we need to think about it a different way. Because I was thinking, stand up, sit down, you have hands, you can do it this way, that way. But there's other disabilities that are out there. So shame on me. So once I was able to do that, I was able to communicate it and connect with other people to go, you know what, you're right. I didn't even think about that. I was thinking that you could sit down. There's diversity is more than just race and gender. And I think we get caught up in that sometimes. And that's why sometimes it gets frustrating. It is so much more. It's size. People get discriminated against for so many things in this world. So just be open to understand, challenge your own thoughts. Don't just come up with the with the thing. If you have the power to come up with the decision, make sure you sit down and really think about it from somebody else's point of view, because it may be that you are limiting and your unconscious bias is showing through what you're trying to get through. That's all.
And that's enough. I'm almost hesitant to even add on to either of those because you both covered it so well. But I think just going back to something I shared, there's just that willingness to come from that perspective that we all have bias. It's literally the way our brains work. We form bias the first minute that I shared this with my team in one of our first lunch and learn sessions of, if you think that you don't have bias, think about the last time you turned on the stove. And if you were compelled to reach out and touch that hot burner, probably not, because we have a bias against getting burned, being hurt. Like that's bias right there. So we all have it. It's what we do with it and what we do when we become aware of it that becomes so important. Being willing to take that pause and say, what's making me think this way? Or why am I recoiling from this correction that someone gave me? Or why am I hesitant to ask someone who's different than myself this question? It's questioning all of those different things. And for me, the way that I try and circumvent my own biases might be just asking that question of, where are you coming from? Like what made you think the way that you're thinking about this topic, or what makes you expect that, you know, I'm not going to be able to meet your need. I come across that a lot with addressing resident situations and them telling me, I know you're not going to do anything about this. Rather than getting defensive and saying like, how dare you assume that I'm not going to be able to help you? I just asked that question of, what makes you think that? Like, what was your experience before that makes you think that this isn't going to go any differently? And letting them share that story with me of what they experienced, and being willing to say, I'm so sorry, I'd feel the same way if I went through that. Knowing that I understand that, though, let's now work forward together, so that you're not thinking that that's how I'm going to approach it, because I'm empathizing with you. I know that that's not the way that this conversation can go. So let's figure out how to do it differently. Being willing to ask those questions and, as Lori said, take the unconsciousness into consciousness and move forward, is so important. And understanding that all of the things that we encounter every day are an opportunity for us to either approach it from a bias mindset where we close ourselves off to it, or from an openness and a bravery mindset where we say, I'm going to ask the questions, I'm going to approach this differently, I'm going to figure out the thing that I don't know or that I maybe came in assuming, but I'm going to reverse my assumption. I'm going to assume that the opposite is true, that I don't know what the background is, and approach this just in a different way.
And just really quick, I like that, what you're saying, Kara, because I feel like it's the key word that you're saying there is having that curiosity to ask and being open and being okay with whatever they say back to you, because you have to be brave in that space and really listen with the intent to understand. But also, I just want to put this out here because we're saying unconscious bias, and I've come across people that say, I don't have unconscious bias, I know what my biases are. Just because you know what they are does not mean it's acceptable. So you still need to change and work through that. So that's all I have to say.
Great. Well, I've seen no other questions come in, so I will go ahead and say to you, Aishia, Kara, and Lori, thank you so much for joining us for today's session and wrapping up NAA's DE&I Awareness Week. And to all the speakers from this week who are online and listening, thank you again as well. It's been a fantastic week of content. And if you want to come back and revisit this session or any session that we've had this week, check out the NAA YouTube page. There's a playlist for DE&I Awareness Week 2023. And with that, everyone have a fantastic weekend, and thank you again.